Today, I'm doing something which seems a bit, well, no, it is a bit grim. It's a name that kind of sticks in your memory. It's an address that sticks in your memory, isn't it? There's also a recent book about it called Peep Show, which kind of alerted me, reminded me about it. Well, it's famous because John Christie um, murdered 7 women and one 14-month-old baby during the late 1940s and early 50s. He buried 6 of the women in the house and small garden at 10 Rillington Place, which is where the police are guarding there, in Notting Hill before it became, when it was still very much a working class neighbourhood. And what is particularly interesting, I think, I'm not going to concentrate too much on the gruesomeness of what went on there, but it reflects both the class structures and widespread racism that was fairly common and actually got worse, I think, in the 1950s. At the time, if you can, I'm sure you can remember as kids that there were areas near where you lived, bombed out houses where you could play on, um, which they were great fun for kids after the war because it was just, you could play all sorts of games on it, couldn't you? So there were severe housing shortages, though the Labour government at the time actually underwent a huge building process, the most that I think was ever built in a short period of time. The inner city areas were full of working class communities, very much packed into substandard housing, strong class prejudice, and increasingly racial tensions. Now, this is John Christie. He was born in 1899 and had his childhood in Halifax. Now, I've got a friend who is convinced that all the most famous serial killers came from Yorkshire. Let's not go there. I've got no reason either to believe it or to think that there's a particular reason for it, but I just thought to mention it. He came from a working class background, and he was, as a child, or as a young boy, he was obviously teased for his frailness and weakness, and in fact, he had to wear glasses and things like that. It badly affected him, I think, his childhood, that in trying to find out the reasons why he ended up like he did. But he certainly struggled with the physical and psychological challenges that he had. But he had a variety of menial jobs, but including one as a sort of temporary police constable during World War II, which came back to help him actually later on. So this is 10 Rillington Place. It was in a cramped, dilapidated, end-terraced house in Notting Hill in overcrowded living condition. It was rented out, and there was an upstairs flat and a downstairs flat. It was eventually demolished in 1971. After the period of the killings, it still survived for quite a while. This is the garden that lay behind it, not in a particularly good shape, but you can see there the policeman on the right-hand side standing over the area where the bodies were actually, some of the bodies had been buried. But it came to light on 24th of March 1953, when a Jamaican called Beresford Wallace Brown, who'd arrived in England in 1950 and got a job as a painter and decorator, was trying to put up a shelf on which to perch his radio while redecorating the ground floor kitchen at 10 Rillington Place, where he was an upstairs tenant. And recently, Christie had moved out of there fairly quickly. The wall sounded hollow behind his hammer, so he stripped off a sheet of wallpaper and spotted a hole in the wooden panel behind it, and saw that there was an alcove behind it. He shone a torch in and saw the white torso of a woman with her head covered. So he and a fellow tenant went to a phone box to call the police. The police came, opened it up, found 2 more bodies stashed away behind the first one. All 3 women who were in the alcove were in their 20s. They had died between January and March of that year. So this is a map of where it was. There's a little arrow on the bottom left pointing to where it was. That was Rillington Place, and that's how it was. It was a cul-de-sac. It was the last house on the cul-de-sac with some sort of a foundry behind it. But it was a decade of murders, effectively, between 1943 and 1953. Now, interestingly, in that same year was the coronation. And that's a picture of the coronation party being held in Rillington Place. The house at the top left is 10 Rillington Place, where the bodies had been found. The guy who was the tenant were asked to vacate the house by the police when they were doing this, and then there were threats against the landlord, who was also actually happened to be a West Indian, and to the tenant, and they were thrown out of the streets, so to speak. And as you can see by the people going to the party, it had then become an all-white area. It was kind of a symbol of the racism going on there. So there they are, actually outside his house. Some of the children in the. It just seems utterly bizarre that that was going on just months after. Here you can see, actually, at the point at which the bodies were found and people were cordoned off from the street, and they formed a crowd. There was obviously great interest in what was going on. Here's a picture of John and Ethel Christie, and her body was found under the floorboards of the same house. She died in December 52, where he killed her there. And after a bit of digging, the skeletons of two more women were found buried in the back garden, which they hadn't seen initially when the ones behind the panelling were found. And those had been there for a decade, the ones found in the garden.
God.
So that's 8 murders in total at this house. There was one of the first women was actually an Austrian-born refugee called Ruth First, who was strangled and like all the others, sexually assaulted. The way that he went about this was by befriending these women. I don't know how. Some of them were prostitutes. One of them he'd worked with, because he was offering them to help them have an abortion. And what he did was pretend to do that, and he'd use town gas, which at that time was, well, not necessarily fatal, but it certainly made people drowsy and ill. And he made them drowsy enough so he could strangle them and then assault them. There was Ethel Christie, whom he killed and buried under the floorboards. There was Kathleen Maloney, who was again in her 20s, and he lured to his home. Rita Nelson, pregnant woman who wanting to have an abortion, and somebody called Hectorina McClellan, who was looking for accommodation with a boyfriend. Interestingly, also, Beryl Evans, the wife of Timothy Evans, and Geraldine, her 14-month-old baby, were also killed. And I'll come on to this later. Now, this is present day, the area. There is no more a Rillington Place. And there's this little small memorial garden standing in the place of where it happened, with no notice or no plaque, because obviously people who live there don't want it brought to people's attention. Now, this is the bit about Timothy Evans. He was arrested and accused of murdering his wife Beryl and his infant daughter Geraldine. Now, he was tried and convicted of the murder, and on the 9th of March in 1950, he was executed by hanging. So those two joined that. He accused his downstairs neighbour, John Christie, who was the chief prosecution witness in the case, of committing the murders. And it's acknowledged later to have been a total miscarriage of justice. And together with the cases of Derek Bentley and Ruth Ellis, both of whom have been wrongly convicted or ended up as being hanged, should say, not hung, hanged by Albert Pierpoint, with some of the cases which led to the removal of capital punishment for murder in 1965. Now, at the time, the media, this is a mock-up for the film, I think, but it was the sort of coverage of it was very much sensationalist reporting. and class-based stereotyping. The reason that Christie was never suspected because he'd been a police constable during the war and was seen as a very respectable individual compared to Timothy Evans, who was seen as a working class ne'er-do-well. Once they found the body behind the wall, Christie had disappeared off. There was a hunt to find him. He was also known as Reginald Christie. That was his second name, John Reginald Christie. So he was obviously a suspect for the serial murder. And they were on the lookout for a middle-aged chap with drawn cheeks, horn-rimmed spectacles, and the glassy, staring eyes. The unfortunate thing was when they went around looking for that, there were so many men who looked like that they got the wrong person several times. So sightings were found at a Lions tea shop near King's Cross, an Italian cafe in Paddington, and a compartment in Bognor Regis were all found. Eventually, he was found, I think, just sitting by the River Thames somewhere. And Ludovic Kennedy, who wrote a book about this in 1970, highlighted what he saw as a shocking bias of the judge in Christie's favour during the Evans trial. This is a quote, the pathetic belief in Christie's integrity coloured almost everything that the judge said about him. Impartiality went by the board entirely. He was a former choir boy, a Boy Scout, came from Halifax, fought in the First World War, where he was temporarily blinded by mustard gas, and been a policeman during the Second World War. So he was an upright citizen, whereas in fact he framed the innocent Evans. So this is Beresford Brown, who'd put in the shelf and initially found the body, and he was it was the only house in the street that housed black tenants, and after that they were evicted from that house, and the place became, as most of the housing in the area did, because it was owned by white people, there was strong prejudice against black people as well. Here's another picture in front of the 10 Rillington Place by the in the coronation celebrations in 1953, which was just after the hunts for Christie. Maybe I don't know whether he was still on the loose at the time, but it seems really bizarre that the killer had just escaped from there, and here they are having a party in the street. The Kensington Post, which advertised rented housing, excluded black and Irish, and the property in Willesden nearby specified British only, one in Earl's Court, English only. And the landlord at the time, who was a Jamaican, he had a letter through the door saying, "Quit England and our boarding houses, you dirty, stinking black and N-word. We don't want you here doing all your filthy breeding. Leave our white women alone or there will be trouble." And so they were basically run out of the street, where the street party was held 2 months later after the bodies were discovered. Now, this is interesting. This is the Attorney General who tried Timothy Evans. And do you know where he came from? Didsbury.
No.
Which I think is Pars Wood in Didsbury. When during the trial, Christie himself would cite the nuisance of the blacks upstairs of one of the things that drove Ethel out to end her own life. This is his Christie. These coloured people tried to kick and dance and made noise continually, and we just couldn't sit in the front room in evenings or weekends. I wish we could get out of here, Ethel had written to her sister Lily. It's awful with these people here. Christie claimed she'd been trying to gas herself, and he had merely helped her to finish the job. I just thought it was an interesting case, just showing what 1950s Britain was like. And I can certainly remember, because in the 60s as well, because Oswald Mosley came to speak in Moss Side. I was at school at St. Bede's, which is in Alexandra Park. His and his followers were at the end of Alexandra Park, just outside it. And I went down there on my bike to see Oswald Mosley speak, but he never spoke because the left-wing protesters and Jewish protesters were down there to throw things at him. So that sort of thing was going on, and it never goes entirely away, does it?
The fascists are on the rise, aren't they? I mean, but in relation to the 50s, I can remember the first time I heard the word nigger, you know, so I come from a very white working class area in the north of Liverpool, and called Anfield. And my mum said to me, she said, there's no one better than you, and there's no one who you look down on. You'll meet black and brown people, and they're just as good as you. You'll meet homosexuals, and she used the proper word, and they are just as good as you.
In that my father, he wasn't rabid or anything, but he was definitely in favour of Enoch Powell,
Yeah.
because we lived in Whalley Range, and Whalley Range was becoming increasingly multicultural. And he found that difficult to cope with. He felt like there was a tide of immigration coming to swallow him up. And somebody like Enoch Powell, of course, fed into all that.
I think it's complex, isn't it? Because my auntie lived in an area of Bolton that became settled by people from India and Pakistan. And she felt when she first moved there, there were no Asian people there at all. And gradually all the shops became Asian and all the houses were taken up by Asian people. And she felt not threatened by it, but displaced in a way. But at the same time, she got on well with her neighbours and would knit clothes for the babies. And, you know, some of them, when she died, some of them sent flowers to her funeral. So two things existed, you know, as individuals, she was very, you know, a good neighbour and got on very well with people. But she felt overwhelmed by the fact that her neighbourhood had completely changed and she hardly recognised, you know, the place she'd moved to anymore. So it was a dual thing, I think. I don't think it's just media. I think there are two very real things going on. There's the, you know, the friendliness and the, you know, the liking of individuals, but a very real feeling of being displaced. And it wasn't to do with the media. You know, I think you have to give credit to that feeling of people not knowing where they live anymore because it's so different. You know, none of the shops are the same. You know,
but I distinctly remember when I lived in Longside and had a black family lived next door, and we got on really well. And then an Asian family moved in across the way. So I did what, you know, the sort of thing you usually do, went across to sort of welcome them and say, you know, anything I can do. And I was blanked.
Oh dear.
Yeah, it does happen. It does happen.
And then in China, I realised how it must feel, because it happened frequently and often. You'd stand on a street corner to look at the map, and then you'd look up, and all of a sudden there was a ring of about a semicircle of about 20 people just staring at you, not saying anything, but just staring at you.
Oh dear.
And then one would take the map out of your hands and look at it, and then it'd go all the way around the semicircle. And it felt really threatening the first couple of times until you realised that eventually it had come back. And it was just curiosity. But when does curiosity become animosity?
I live in Mossley and I've lived in Mossley for more than 40 years, but I'm still a comer in.
Yeah.
That happens.
Hey, have a good day, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Bernard.
Yeah,
and you.